am returning to the content, well, briefly to the content of the environmental impact assessment to follow John, but then going on to the EIA process as well. But just like to say a couple words about the content. John mentioned many of the issues that need to be considered, and just taking the housing, for example. All of your development may be out in areas that have literally no housing, that you may be using man camps completely. Whatever that situation, or if you start developing unconventional gas closer to communities, you may have an availability of housing or a potential for housing to be provided. And that's the sort of thing that you would indicate in your baseline of the environmental assessment, and then in the consequences, you know, what is the need, what is going to happen, how many people are expected to come in, how long are they going to stay, how are you going to provide for, or how is the industry going to provide for the housing, if it's the industry indeed that's going to provide, or is that going to be a responsibility of the government, either the local government or the national government. So it's parsing out those details of each resource and each environmental and social impact that is going to be part of the development that is necessary in the environmental assessment. In terms of the natural environment, again, I emphasize that both pros and cons need to be addressed in the impact statement, and basically all of the issues that we've talked about for the last couple of days and will continue have to be included, and we'll hear more on the water aspects of it. I'm not sure whether it's before or after the break as well. But some of the things that have not been mentioned too much is, in terms of water, for example, are things like floodplains and wetlands, and just the natural water bodies that are in an area and how those will be impacted. So another aspect that we haven't talked about much is historic and archaeological and cultural resources, and how those might be affected by development. So I'm going to leave the sort of the content of the EIA aside for now and get on to the EIA process. And in terms of the process, we're talking about both the document preparation and review, and I'll use mostly examples from the US, but also Ukraine here, and then also transparency and public participation, and again, those examples. So I don't know, I think this is probably easier to read than some of my other ones. But just in terms of the environmental impact statement from the United States, what I guess we haven't talked about what actually prompts us to have an impact analysis. And in the United States, we have both federal and state level documents. Here I've got listed that the federal action, what prompts the need to perform an environmental assessment of some sort is that the federal action may significantly affect the environment. And when we talk about action, we talk about projects, but we also talk about the government issuing a permit or a license or funding a project. So it doesn't have to be the government actually doing something. So something like unconventional gas development is prime in that area of action by the federal government because of all the permits, or the land. In the case of federal land and federal minerals, they have to authorize the use of those. So all of those things would prompt preparation of an environmental document. Again, we've talked about already the identifying and evaluating the consequences of identifying and evaluating consequences or impacts of the development. In Ukraine, it was a little bit different. They had a set of types of projects that would be subject to an environmental impact statement, and also in specifically enumerated projects. There was no requirement that there be a federal action involved. So in the United States, if there is a project that's being done that has no government involvement at all, it could be quite a large industrial development, but if it has no funding, no permits, whatever, that can be unusual, but that would not require an environmental impact statement in the United States. In Ukraine, their impact analysis also applies to draft laws, which I thought was interesting. Given the pace at which they were changing laws, I'm not sure how often they apply that, but it was a requirement. And then again, they identify and evaluate impacts. The last thing I have in this category, this process, not substance, and positive determination. In the United States, the environmental impact statement is a process. It's an evaluation of impacts. It's a determination of whether there's significant impacts or not. But that's basically where it ends. There is no requirement if there are significant impacts from a project. There is no requirement to change the project. There is no requirement to deny the project. It can go forward. So the process of environmental impact assessment in the United States is just that. You have to recognize that there are impacts, and then you make the decision. The government body that's in charge of this particular project makes the decision to go ahead or not go ahead, or to modify it, or in terms of their approval. They might modify it. I talked about preferred alternatives. So that may come into play. But there's no requirement for a project to be without significant impacts in order to go forward. Just in terms of the history of the U.S. and Ukraine environmental impact assessments, we have a long history. Our law was basically 1969. Ukraine is 1991. I think we have relatively clear standards. We certainly have a lot of detailed regulations describing what needs to be done in terms of an environmental impact statement. In Ukraine, it was less clear. They have some standards, some regulations, but it was even unclear whether their basic law dealing with environmental impact statements or a new law that was dealing with town planning would apply in certain oil and gas situations. So their law was a little bit more being changed over time. There have been many attempts or thoughts to change the National Environmental Policy Act, but it hasn't gone anywhere, and I think it's because some people think it needs to be changed, and I'll get down to that a little bit later, but others are just not willing to go there. In the United States, the product of the analysis is very much subject to litigation, especially on process. Whether or not the whether or not there was sufficient baseline, whether or not the alternatives were broadly defined enough, whether or not the consequences were adequately evaluated. So it's very subject to litigation. In Ukraine, not so much in their in their state courts, but in their national courts, it was litigated, and I'll get to that again. In the U.S., the agency is responsible for preparing the environmental impact assessment or statement. It is often done by contractors who are paid, whose funding comes from the proponent of the project, but they are directed by the agency, and that's mostly a timing constraint. The agencies don't have the personnel, they don't have the time, they don't have the resources to do a big environmental impact statement, and these can be very large, large projects. The statement itself can be a very large undertaking, and so it will be hired, but the agency is responsible for the document, and it is considered the agency's document at the end. In contrast, in Ukraine, the document itself was prepared by the proponent of the project. We've already gone over this for the U.S. In Ukraine, minimal evaluation of alternatives. They specifically deal with the project that's proposed. A little bit more in terms of scoping. This is one of the most important parts of environmental impact assessment. And in the U.S., the scoping, which includes both education and comment by the public, is extensive. And there are multiple methods used. There are meetings, there are press conferences, there is electronic information spread, there are hard copies of information spread. So it's a very detailed process. There are websites that an agency will have, which will detail the meetings that will be held and where they will be and what the topics will be. There will be working groups. I talked a little bit yesterday about stakeholder meetings. There will be that kind of meeting. So just about anything people want, they will do in terms of scoping. And then comments can be given in person, they can be given in writing, they can be given electronically through government websites. And it's just a large part of the process. In the Ukraine, on the other hand, it's very minimal and very controversial. And I mentioned that there was ability to litigate in Ukraine on environmental impact assessments, and most of it is done through this Aarhus Convention and the bodies that they have there. And the main contention is that there is not enough public participation, and so the NGOs, if they feel that they haven't been involved, they can sue through the convention. Access to information, I think in the United States is very good. We have lots of information, and it's generally easy to get, and the agencies realize that it's easy to get and that they need to make it available to people, so they're very good about doing that. If they fail in the informal sense, then there is a formal process of requesting information under our Freedom of Information Act. And it's a formal request and it's a formal response, and you can get it. It's much more time consuming, but you can get it. In Ukraine, again, by law, it is freely available on environmental matters, but poor in practice. I think partially by intent and partially just by not having the resources. People talked about asking for information and just having no one there available to transfer it to them. They also, one very strange thing was, I'll talk here about the types of documents that are produced in the process, but in terms of access to information, the local people have no access to the final environmental impact statement. They have access to the draft, but not the final. And that has some problems later on in terms of implementing. Just a brief look at the documents that are produced. In the United States, we have scoping documents, we have draft environmental impact statements, we have final environmental impact statements, and we have sometimes supplemental draft and supplemental final impact statements. And then finally, the ROD that I've got indicated is a record of decision. So that's the document in which the government says, this is what we've decided and this is how we'll go forward. It's reviewed by both the agency and the public, and as I say, in Ukraine, only the draft is reviewed by the public. The capacity in the United States to do environmental assessments is very good. There are multiple agencies involved. The quality of the people in the agencies, I think, is very good. Sometimes they are overwhelmed with work, and that's why some of these are done by contractors. In Ukraine, the staff need training, the staff need government backing to support their work, and they don't always get that. Partially because the government changes frequently. And even if the national government doesn't change frequently, the agencies are reorganized frequently, and that causes a lot of problems in something as simple as doing an environmental assessment. And the last, burdensome. I think there's a difference of opinion on whether or not the NEPA process in the United States is burdensome or not, but there's always controversies. And in Ukraine, I don't think it's burdensome because it is pretty minimal in the way they work on it. I've talked a little bit about, let's see, change notes here. Talked a little bit about scoping, but I wanted to mention that part of the question is whether scoping, it's education and it's an identification of issues, but the question is it just for the government, or is it just for the public, or a combination? And local government is another entity that I think needs to be considered. Local government in Ukraine local government in the United States is always active in in these evaluations. Local government in Ukraine, less so active, and it was very partitioned sort of responsibilities. And there was a lot of controversy over whether or not the local governments would have say in the process, would have say in evaluation of things, and would have any really benefit from the development. This is just to talk very in general about the scope of environmental documents. The one on the left is a record of decision from a Montana decision of final supplemental EIS to the Montana statewide oil and gas environmental impact statement, and also proposed amendment to the Powder River Basin resource management plan. I talked a little bit yesterday about one of the ways in which mitigation measures are incorporated in developments are through through planning processes, and resource development plans are one of those. And as the government plans what it's going to do in a particular area of its land, it has to do an environmental assessment or impact statement, whatever, related to that planning as well. So there may be a document related to the planning, and then there may be a document related to the actual oil and gas development. And then this other is just an example. This is a website that is, or a portion of a website that's dedicated to the revised draft, shale gas. Shale gas EIS in New York, and it has all of the documents that are being considered, all of the schedules, all of the comments that people have submitted. So it's just a way of organizing all of the information that is needed to adequately analyze the impacts, and to help people recognize, the community people recognize that they are being considered, they are being heard. They don't always agree, but they. Okay, and then last few minutes on ensuring implementation of the decisions that are made in these sort of documents, and that might include management plans, again, corporate ethics, monitoring, enforcement, and funding. Specifically, management plans, you can have a management plan in an environmental document, and in the United States that may end up being incorporated in law. So the decisions that are made, the promises that are made in order to reduce or minimize impacts might be eventually included in lease stipulations for the development. They might be included in as permit conditions of approval, and in example of Ukraine, they might be considered, or they might be included as provisions of the production sharing agreements that are finally created. In terms of corporate ethics, this is just a list, another one you can't read, but a list of corporate ethics from different companies working in oil and gas. And these are specifically related to participation of indigenous communities. But it's just one example of how the corporations may also have their own plans of how to deal with issues and how to make sure that the environmental impact assessment information is actually put into practice. Monitoring enforcement, there's a controversy in the United States whether it should be the federal government, the state government, or the local governments doing monitoring, and it varies from different issues. Local governments sometimes want inspection capabilities because they are on the ground, because they are local, and because they have different concerns from the federal or state governments. Self-monitoring and reporting by corporate entities is also part of it, and that can be an important aspect. Question is how much, and the atmosphere of safety, or the corporate responsibility for safety that John talked about yesterday, I think fits very well into this. You may not want to rely completely on self-monitoring and reporting, but it can be one aspect of it as well. Ukraine, I talked about a little bit yesterday about in terms of their problems with enforcement and monitoring. And then the last is funding. Monitoring is one of the important aspects of making sure that a plan is implemented, making sure that whatever you've decided in your environmental assessment is going to be implemented. And funding for monitoring is important because once you get into a project, it's often lost. It may be planned early, and we're hoping, or we all hope, that the baseline information that's collected is collected with the eye toward monitoring and follow-up to make sure that any impacts are identified early. But funding for that can be a problem. And I think there's been a little bit of discussion about that, but it should be considered well in advance. And I'm going to end on that. I was going to ask if people had other folks from the different panels wanted to comment on their own state's environmental impact assessment process and how well they work or how well they don't work. But I don't think I'm going to do that now, but maybe if people have questions, or maybe some of the people that are on the panels for further questions want to comment on that. I've given the perspective from the federal end of things, a tiny bit from the state end of things, and a little bit from Ukraine, but there are variations throughout the United States, so other perspectives would be welcome as well. That's it.